The medieval Bulgarian army was the primary military body of the First and the Second Bulgarian Empires. During the first decades after the foundation of the country, the army consisted of a Bulgar cavalry and a Slavic infantry. The core of the Bulgarian army was the Heavy Cavalry, which consisted of 12,000–30,000 heavily armed riders. At its height in the 9th and 10th centuries, it was one of the most formidable military forces in Europe and was feared by its enemies. There are several documented cases of Byzantine commanders abandoning an invasion because of a reluctance to confront the Bulgarian army on its home territory. The army was intrinsically linked to the very existence of the Bulgarian state. Its success under Tsar Simeon I marked the creation of a wide-ranging empire, and its defeat in a prolonged war of attrition in the early 11th century meant the end of Bulgarian independence. When the Bulgarian state was re-established in 1185, a series of capable emperors achieved a remarkable string of victories over the Byzantines and the Western Crusaders. But as the state and its army fragmented in the 13th and 14th centuries, it proved unable to halt the Ottoman advance, which resulted in the conquest of all of Bulgaria by 1422. It would not be until 1878, with the liberation of Bulgaria, that a Bulgarian military would be restored. History. 7th–8th century. The early Bulgars were a warlike people and war was part of their everyday life, with every adult Bulgar obliged to fight. The early Bulgars were exclusively horsemen. In their culture, the horse was considered a sacred animal and received special care. The supreme commander was the Khan, who mustered the army with the help of the aristocracy. The military ranks from a lowest to highest were Bagain, Bagatur, Boil, Tarkan. The permanent army consisted of the Khan's guard of select warriors, while the campaign army consisted practically of the entire nation, assembled by clans. In the field, the army was divided into right and left wings. The Bulgars were well versed in the use of stratagems. They often held a strong cavalry unit in reserve, which would attack the enemy at an opportune moment. They also sometimes concentrated the free horses behind the battle formation to avoid surprise attacks from the rear. They used ambushes and feigned retreats, during which they rode with the backs to the horse, firing clouds of arrows on the enemy. If the enemy pursued disorganized, they would turn back and fiercely attack them. According to contemporary historians, the Bulgars could see in the dark like bats, and often fought at night. The Bulgarian army was well armed according to the other model. The soldiers had a saber or a sword, a long spear and a bow with an arrow quiver on the back. On the saddle they hung a round shield, a mace and a lasso, which the Bulgarians called arkani. On the decorated belts the soldiers carried the most necessary objects such as flints and steel, a knife, a cup and a needle case. The heavy cavalry was supplied with metal armor and helmets. The horses were also armored. Armor was of two types, chain mail and plate armor. The commanders had belts with gold and silver buckles which corresponded to the rank and title. The army had iron discipline, with the officers vigorously checking if everything was ready before a battle. For a horse that was undernourished and not properly taken care of, the punishment was death. The soldiers were under threat of a death penalty when having a loose bowstring or an unmaintained sword, or even if riding a war horse in peacetime. The infantry of the newly formed state was composed mainly of Slavs, who were generally lightly armed soldiers. Although the chieftains usually had small cavalry retinues, the Slavic footmen were equipped with swords, spears, bows and wooden or leather shields. However, they were less disciplined and less effective than the Bulgar cavalry. In 680, the Byzantines under Constantine IV were crushed in the Battle of Ongel and were forced to conclude a humiliating peace treaty by which they jure acknowledged the formation of a Bulgarian state on the former territory. In 718, a Bulgarian intervention was crucial in the repulsion of the Second Arab Siege of Constantinople. According to contemporaries, the Arabs feared the Bulgarian army and built trenches to protect themselves from a cavalry charge. In the decisive battle in the summer that year, the Bulgarians slaughtered between 20,000 and 32,000 Arabs. Apart from engaging in battle to the south, the Bulgarians had to fight the Avars to the northwest and the Khazars to the northeast. After bloody fights between the Dniester and the Dnieper rivers, the Khazar threat was eliminated, but the founder of the Bulgarian state, Khan Asparukh, perished in one of the battles in 700. Krum's dynasty. On the turn of the 9th century, the Bulgarian Empire was on the rise. Following the victory over the Byzantines at Marseilles in 792, the country overcame a 50-year crisis and entered the new century stronger and consolidated. During the first years of his reign, Khan Krum destroyed the Avar Khaganate and doubled Bulgaria's territory, taking over the fertile Pannonian plain and the salt and gold mines of Transylvania. Krum achieved major victories over the Byzantine Empire, annihilating the Byzantine armies in the Battle of Pliska and at Versinikia, while capturing the important city of Sofia in 809. The Byzantine historian Pseudo-Simeon stated that Krum sent a 30,000-strong cavalry, the whole armored with iron, which devastated Thrace. According to inscriptions found in the region of Pliska, Preslav Mardara and Shabla in northeastern Bulgaria, armaments for 1,713 heavy riders were available. Assuming that the surviving inscriptions are around 1/10 of the total number, that makes 17,130 men only in the Sikuld, in a region of Bulgaria. After comparison with the data of Pseudo-Simeon, it can be assumed that the heavy cavalry component of the Bulgarian army numbered between 17,000–20,000 and 30,000 men, depending on the level of mobilization. During the end of the 9th and the beginning of the 10th centuries, Emperor Simeon the Great was able to lead in battle more than 60,000 soldiers. Traditionally, the army's commander-in-chief was the ruler. The second in the chain of command was the Kavkhan, who led the army during the emperor's absence. The third most important title in the hierarchy was the Achig Uboil, who commanded the garrison of the capital. In the field, the army was divided into three parts: center, right flank and left flank. The center was commanded by the ruler, the left flank by the Kavkhan, and the right flank by the Achig Uboil. Other high military ranks included the Tarkan, which was equal to the Byzantine strategos according to Stephen Runciman, and the higher officers were called Bagain. All higher military ranks were part of the Bulgarian nobility called Boyars or Boils. Decline under Peter I. During the long years of warfare under Tsar Simeon I the Great, the country was exhausted. The constant wars were unpopular enough so that 20,000 people sought refuge in Byzantium because of Simeon's warlike Russian relentless intentions. His successor Peter I concluded a favorable peace treaty with the Byzantines, but the situation inside the country saw no improvement. There were many reasons for the decline. Some historians dismiss Peter I as a weak ruler, incapable of handling his own family. Furthermore, in the mid-10th century, the new Bogomil heresy spread itself widely over the country. The Bogomils preached that people must not follow secular authorities, pay taxes or enroll in the army. As a result, the Bulgarians were unable to stop the Magyars, who looted and plundered the countryside. further contributing to the grim situation of the state. When the Byzantines paid the Knyaz Sviatoslav to invade Bulgaria in 968, Peter I could send only 30,000 men against the 60,000-strong invading force. During the Rus invasion between 968 and 971, the Bulgarians de facto lost control of the northeastern parts of the country, including the capital Preslav, and in 970, Sviatoslav massacred 300 Bulgarian nobles, the elite of the Bulgarian nation and army, in Silistra. Untitled dynasty. The fall of the northeastern parts of the Bulgarian Empire under Byzantine rule and the decimation of its military elite had a severe impact on the Bulgarian army, especially since most of the heavy cavalry which was instrumental in the earlier successes over the Byzantines was recruited exactly in that region. Contemporary sources continue to mention the existence of a Bulgarian cavalry, but it was much reduced in size and was mostly light cavalry. Consequently, the infantry's importance grew and the tactics changed to reflect the new conditions. The ambush, although employed in the past, now became the cornerstone of Bulgarian tactics. Most Bulgarian victories in that period were a result of ambush and careful exploitation of the terrain. During this period, the Bulgarians acquired a reputation for the skillful archers. Despite those difficulties, Emperor Samuil resisted the Byzantine army, which reached its zenith under Basil II, for nearly half a century. In 976, the Bulgarians, led by the Kumtopuli brothers, reconquered the northeastern parts of the realm. The first Byzantine attempts for counter-attack were repulsed after the annihilation of a 60,000 force in the Battle of the Gates of Trajan in 986, in which Basil II himself barely escaped. In the following decade, the Bulgarians took Thessaly, destroyed the Principality of Duclia, advanced deep to the south as far as Corinth on the Peloponnese Peninsula, and campaigned in Dalmatia and Bosnia. However, a major defeat at the Battle of Spercheios in 996 signaled that the tide of the war had begun to change in the Byzantines' favor. From 1001 onwards, Basil II launched yearly campaigns into Bulgarian territory, methodically taking important cities such as Preslav, Pliska and Vidan, and inflicting several defeats on Samuil. In addition, in 1003 Samuil was involved in a war with the Kingdom of Hungary. After years of campaigning, in 1014, in the decisive Battle of Klydion, the Bulgarian army was crushed and 14,000 captured Bulgarian soldiers were blinded and sent to Samuil, who died at the sight of his army on the 6th of October. In the Battle of Klydion, the Bulgarian army numbered around 20,000 soldiers. According to some estimates, the total number of the army, including the squads of local militia, reached a maximum level of 45,000. The Byzantine historian Georgius Monachus Continuatus read that the Bulgarian army had 360,000 men, a greatly exaggerated number, the actual being 10 times smaller. Asen dynasty. In 1185, the Bulgarian Empire was restored as a result of the successful rebellion of Asen Peter, who founded the new Asen dynasty. The long period of Byzantine rule had left its mark on the Bulgarian army. The titles during the Second Empire were mostly borrowed from Byzantium. In the absence of the emperor, the commander-in-chief was called Velik Voivoda. The commander of smaller squads was a voivoda, and a strater was the person responsible for the defense of certain regions and the recruitment of soldiers. In the late 12th century, the army numbered 40,000 men-at-arms. The country was able to mobilize around 100,000 men in the first decade of the 13th century. In the period, the Bulgarian Bulgarian army used large numbers of Cuman cavalry which numbered between 10,000 and 30,000 riders, depending on the campaign. These were drawn from among the Cumans who inhabited Wallachia and Moldavia, and were at least nominally under the suzerainty of the Bulgarian emperors. The army was well supplied with siege equipment, including battering rams, siege towers and catapults. In the first 50 years after the re-establishment of the empire, the Bulgarians, led by skillful commanders such as Peter IV, Ivan Aseni, Kaloyan and Ivan Asen II, achieved massive military successes. After a number of successful battles between 1185 and 1204, the Byzantine Empire was effectively driven from the lands it held in the northern Balkans, and the imperial crown and cross. The army of the Crusaders, who established the new Latin Empire, were in turn annihilated in the Battle of Adrianople, when their emperor was captured, and again at Rujan in 1206. The Hungarians were defeated after several fights along the valley of the Mirava River in 1202. After several setbacks, under Borolai, Ivan Asen II decisively defeated the Despotate of Epirus in the Battle of Klokotnitsa, in which the much smaller Bulgarian army outmaneuvered its enemy. In 1241, the Tsar defeated a Mongol army, fighting under Batu Khan and Subutai, Turta and Shishman dynasties. The country and the army declined after Ivan Aseni's death. His successors could not cope neither with the external nor with the internal problems. Mongol, Byzantine and Hungarian invasions were combined with separatism among the nobility and several civil wars. In 1277, a peasant named Ivalo rebelled against Emperor Constantine II. In the ensuing battle the emperor was defeated and slain, and Ivalo proclaimed himself Emperor of Bulgaria in Tarnovo. Although he managed to defeat both the Mongols and the Byzantines, a plot among the nobility forced him to seek refuge among the Mongol Golden Horde, where he was killed in 1280. The army now numbered less than 10,000 men. It is recorded that Ivalo defeated two Byzantine armies of 5,000 and 10,000 men, and that his troops were outnumbered in both cases. After the end of the rebellion of Ivalo, the Bulgarians were no match for the Mongols, who plundered the country undisturbed for 20 years. With the reign of Theodore Svetoslav, the situation of the army improved. In 1304 he defeated the Byzantines at Skafida. Under his successor the garrison of Plovdiv numbered 2,000 heavily armed footmen and 1,000 horsemen. In 1330 Michael III Shishman raised a 15,000-strong army to face the Serbs but was defeated at the Battle of Velbaj. 2 years later the Bulgarian army numbered 11,000 men. When the Ottoman Turks invaded Bulgaria and the Balkans in the mid-14th century, the once glorious Bulgarian army was only a shadow of its former self. Feudal disunion and the widespread heretical movements such as Bogomilism, the Adamites of the Valamites, did not allow the country to maintain a significant force. The Bulgarians relied on the fortified cities and castles for defense, but due to the lack of a common leadership, coordination amongst them was feeble and they were defeated and occupied in detail. Initially, the Ottoman invasion was not considered as a significant threat by both Bulgarians and Byzantines. For only 1 decade between 1354 and 1364 the Ottomans conquered virtually the whole of Thrace, seizing large cities such as Plovdiv, Beria, Dianopolis and Adrianople and defeating several small Bulgarian forces. The centuries-old mistrust between Bulgarians and Byzantines spoiled the negotiations between the two empires for an alliance and even led to the last Byzantine-Bulgarian War in 1364. In 1371 a large Bulgarian Serb army under Vukašin Mrnjavčević and Jorvand Uglješa, two feudal lords in Macedonia, was annihilated by the Ottomans under Lala Shavhan Pasha at Chernomen, and soon the Bulgarian emperor had to admit the defeat and became a vassal to the invaders. Numerous Bulgarian fortresses in the Rhodope Mountains, Sofia Valley and eastern Bulgaria were captured one by one over the next 20 years. In 1393 the capital Tarnovo was besieged and seized by the Ottoman Turks, and 3 years later fell Vidan, the last major Bulgarian city. Resistance to the invaders continued until 1422, when the country was fully conquered. The Ottoman invasion was a disaster for the Bulgarian army. The nobility and the leaders of the nation were killed or emigrated, and civilians were not allowed to have weapons until the 19th century. Tactics. The Bulgarian army employed various military tactics. It relied both on the experience of the soldiers and the peculiarities of the terrain. The Balkan Mountains played a significant role in the military history of Bulgaria and facilitated the country's defense against the strong Byzantine army, which conveyed the Roman military art in the Middle Ages. Most of the 9 campaigns of the ambitious Emperor Constantine V to eliminate the young Bulgarian state, which suffered political crisis, failed in the mountain passes of the Balkan. In 811 the whole Byzantine army was destroyed in the Varbitsa Pass, and in 12th–13th centuries several other Byzantine forces shared that doom. The Bulgarians maintained many outposts and castles which guarded the passes and were able to locate an invading force and quickly inform the high command about any enemy moves. Another widely used tactic was to make a false retreat and then suddenly attack the enemy, breaking the lines when in pursuit. This trick won many victories, most notably at the Battle of Adrianople in 1205 against the Crusaders. Sometimes the Bulgarians left a strong cavalry force in reserve which attacked in the sublime moment and tipped the balance in Bulgarians' favor. For instance, in the Battle of Anchialus in 917. Ambush was another widely used and very successful strategy, especially during the Kamtopili dynasty. The Bulgarians usually avoided frontal assault and waited the enemy to attack first. After the opponent inevitably breaks his battle formation, the Bulgarians would counter-attack with the heavy cavalry. In several battles the Bulgarian troops waited the Byzantines for days until the latter attacked, for instance at Marsilia Versinikia, and scored decisive victories. In one of the rare occasions in which the army made a frontal attack on the enemy, the result was a defeat despite the heavy casualties the enemy suffered. Battle of Anchialus. After a successful battle, the Bulgarian would pursue the enemy in depth in order to eliminate as much soldiers as possible and not to allow him to reorganize his forces quickly and effectively. For instance, after the victory at Ongel in 680, the Byzantines were chased for 150 to 200 kilometers. After the success at Anchialus in 917, the Byzantines were not given time to prepare the resistance properly, and the result was the annihilation of the last forces in the Battle of Katasiritai. During war, the Bulgarians usually sent light cavalry to devastate the enemy lands on a broad front, pillaging villages and small towns, burning the crops and taking people and cattle. During the Second Empire, the task was usually assigned to the Cumans. The Bulgarian army was very mobile. For instance, prior to the Battle of Klekotnitsa, for 4 days it covered a distance 3 times longer than the Epirot army for a week. In 1332 it covered 230 kilometers for 5 days. Siege equipment. The early Bulgarian army was not supplied with strong siege equipment. The Bulgarians used siege machines on a large scale for the first time during the reign of Khan Krum. when they employed Arab renegades to gain experience. By 814, they possessed a large number of enormous siege machines, battering rams, ballistas, mangonels, catapults, siege towers, machines against battlements. They were transported by 5,000 iron-covered carts, hauled by 10,000 oxen. In addition, after the siege of Mesembria, the Bulgarians captured 36 copper siphons, which the Byzantines used to throw the famous Greek fire. A wide range of siege equipment was also used during the Second Empire. During the siege of Adrianople in 1207, Emperor Kaloyan had 33 catapults and an engineer corps which was tasked with destroying the city walls. In the beginning of the 13th century, during the siege of Varna, the Bulgarians constructed an enormous siege tower which was wider than the moat of the fortress. Foreign and mercenary soldiers. After the Bulgarians conquered the Avar Khanate in 804–805, Avar soldiers, who were now subjects of the Bulgarian crown, were recruited in the army, especially during the campaign against Nicephorus I in 811, when the Byzantines burned down the capital, Pliska. In the 9th–10th centuries, the Bulgarians often resorted to the services of the Pechenegs, who were probably Bulgarian federates. When the Byzantines stirred the Kievan Rus up against the empire, the Bulgarian diplomacy in turn used the Pechenegs against Rus. During the Second Empire, foreign and mercenary soldiers became an important part of the Bulgarian army and its tactics. Since the very beginning of the rebellion of Asen and Peter, the light and mobile Cuman cavalry was effectively used against the Byzantines and later the Crusaders. For instance, 14,000 of them were used by Kaloyan in the Battle of Adrianople. The Cumans were the empire's most effective military component. The Cuman leaders entered the ranks of Bulgarian nobility, and some of them received high military or administrative posts in the state. During the 14th century, the Bulgarian army increasingly relied on foreign mercenaries, which included Western Knights, Mongols, Ossetians that came from vassal Wallachia. Both Michael III Shishman and Ivan Alexander had a 3,000-strong Mongol cavalry detachment in their armies. In the 1350s, Emperor Ivan Alexander even hired Ottoman bands, as did the Byzantine emperor. Russians were also hired as mercenaries. Conflicts.